I am your host, Nicole Will, and we're so happy you're here as we navigate the world with your aging loved one. We are here to come alongside older adults, family members, and the senior living community as we explore the world of aging and elder care with helpful resources, informative interviews, and approachable conversation. We get to do this together, so join us on our journey, and this is the Will Gather podcast. How does having an understanding of childhood adversity and trauma shape the way that we care and support our older adults? Today, my guest is Jean Hartnett. She is a visionary healthcare leader with over 25 years of executive experience serving the older adult population. She has worked hands-on with our older adults and professionals. She also has a deep understanding of health public policy issues. She brings all of her experience as we talk today about the importance of trauma-informed care. Jean shares about those common types of childhood adversity and the impact they have on our physical and mental health, how we as caregivers and healthcare providers can recognize the signs of trauma and create effective strategies. We look at what resources and tools can support us as we do this work. We also talk about some of the challenges and benefits of implementing the trauma-informed approach to care and how she sees the field of senior care evolving and what role this approach takes. How we as families can understand and be informed about the impact of childhood trauma on our loved one's life and how we can overcome the stigma and misconceptions surrounding mental health. According to the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, 90% of our older adults that we serve have experienced at least one form of the common types of childhood adversity and trauma. As we build a trauma-informed community and promote healing for our older adults, I'm so happy that Jean can join me today. Here is my interview with Jean Hartnett. Hi, Jean. I'm just so happy that we're getting to do this today. You have such a compassionate heart and approach in how you share and explain things. I'm excited for everybody else to be able to step into this conversation and learn from you. So thank you for being here.
Oh my gosh, it's my absolute pleasure, Nicole. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yes, mine too. This is going to be so fun. And I cannot wait to hear more about your background and how you became interested in this person-centered trauma-informed care. It's a topic that I've honestly been really wanting to talk about for a really long time. I think it's important, and I think it's one we do not often discuss in the lens of older adults and caregivers. So,
Right,
yeah.
right. We don't. And, you will find out in this discussion that I am really passionate not only about senior care, older adults, and those that work and support them from a caregiver standpoint in assisted livings and nursing homes, but also family caregivers, because I've been all three of
Yeah.
those. But I come to this conversation as a person that's been in our field since 1989. It was 2021 when I first discovered these concepts of person-centered trauma-informed care. And so I'm going to be really excited to share with all of your listeners kind of what that ideology looked like and my evolution to becoming kind of this trauma-informed prophet and dive right in with you on those details.
Absolutely. Yes. And you have a background, right, in nursing home administration, that family caregiving side. And so working with those older adults, those families in those communities, it shapes how we look at our view and our lens on the world and what we feel needs our attention and
Right.
conversation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I actually got started in the senior care field, like I mentioned, in 1989. And if you know anything about, and I know you do, but if your listeners know anything about how nursing homes developed over the decades, 1989 and the early 90s is a really pivotal time for our profession because a couple of years before 1989, the Omnibus Reconciliation Act of 1987 was passed, also known as OBRA 87. And anytime that there is a bill that is being debated in the House and the Senate Some bills just don't get passed because it doesn't have the majority in either house. But a budget bill is one of those bills that has to be passed. And so it's not atypical for senators and Congress people to attach a lot of amendments to a budget bill in order for those amendments to be passed, because they're almost certain that a budget bill will be passed. So in 1987, that's what happened. We had a budget bill, but then attached to that was this extraordinarily long piece of legislation that became the Nursing Home Reform Act. And so I was operating in our nursing homes as a frontline caregiver when that legislation was being operationalized in my nursing home. And it was there that I learned just the importance of public policy and its impact on operations, but also the impact it has on the front line. And so with that, I've always had an appreciation for what public policy looks like as we attempt to implement all of the regulations in our nursing homes. So fast forward from 1989 all the way to 2019, I'm no longer a certified nursing assistant, but instead I'm an administrator or a chief executive officer of the largest nursing home in Nebraska, which consisted of 293 beds of skilled nursing, where we were divided up in all types of programs, such as skilled rehab and behavioral health and dementia care. And at the time, we were implementing the second wave of nursing home reform through what was called the requirements of participation. And one of those requirements that they left for phase 3, because they phased it into 3 phases, was this notion of person-centered trauma-informed care. And as you can tell, I've been in the field for decades, but I had no idea, Nicole, what trauma-informed care meant, how to implement it, and why it was important to do so.
I'm so glad you gave us that history and perspective. It does give us more of an understanding of how we're here and how we got here.
Yes. So I know that I wasn't alone. You know, a lot of my colleagues that I talked to as we're implementing the requirements of participation didn't understand this regulation either. And the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, for your listeners' benefit, is that organization that funds nursing homes, but also regulates them. So they're kind of our banker and our parent. So we have to be super beholden to the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. So when this regulation came out, I had a call with about 3 nurse consultants from the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, because I thought to myself, there's no way for me to implement this regulation appropriately unless I understand the context. Like, what is it exactly that you're looking for? And what these 3 nurse consultants shared with me, and I'll never forget it, is that they indicated that over 90% of individuals that we care for, whether in a community setting or in a residential setting, likely have a history of trauma. And that was very impactful to me.
Wow. That is a large amount. It really is. So what was their feedback? Did they give any guideline? Or I know a lot of times they say, here are the guidelines, and then it's right open to that interpretation.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's what I really struggled with, I'll be honest with you, is that, okay, I know that I have the language of the legislation and the language of the regulation. I understand its context, but Nicole, I was still missing that. How do I do it? And what is its importance? And if I, as the leader of the organization, don't understand the context and the importance, how am I going to train effectively and train with the passion that I have and the importance and the urgency that I normally have around a lot of different topics? So it wasn't until I actually left senior living and went to a children's hospital here in Omaha, Nebraska, where I learned about trauma. So my team at Children's Hospital consisted of nurse case managers and social workers. So we are the individuals working with families and their children to figure out how are we going to manage from a clinical perspective all of the medical complexities that you're presenting our team with, our physician team, our nurses team, our rehab team, et cetera. Our social workers, on the other hand, would look at the social aspects of healing. So, does your family have enough access to food? Do you have adequate housing? Do you have adequate transportation? All of those social determinants of health. And one of the things that my team started doing is they implemented what is known as ACEs, which stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. Have you ever heard of ACEs? Are you familiar with ACEs?
I'm not until you had brought it up, and I'm like, okay, yes, I want to learn more about this.
Okay, great. Well, so ACEs stands for, like I said, Adverse Childhood Experiences. And an internal medicine physician in 1998 discovered that there are 10 childhood adversities that we experience or can experience when we're children that directly impact your health and well-being, that being the physical health and the mental health of yourself as you age. And there's a direct correlation between these 10 adverse childhood experiences with the adult onset of alcoholism, the adult onset of COPD, of getting certain cancers, of having heart disease. And so when my team was explaining to me ACEs and the 10 categories that they were assessing for included child physical abuse, child sexual abuse, child emotional abuse, physical and emotional neglect, having a parent or an individual in the home that is mentally ill or depressed, having a family member or someone in the home that is drug addicted, witnessing violence against your mother, and also the incarceration of a family member. All of these categories, this internal medicine physician found directly impacted how you are going to age and how you're going to move into adulthood.
Wow.
So once I understood that from my social workers, I just thought to myself, Nicole, back on my decades of working in senior living and thought, oh my goodness, why aren't we doing an ACEs-like assessment in senior living?
Yeah.
And so that fire in my belly to get this done and to really understand it has been brewing inside of me since about 2017, 2018, when I learned about this.
I'm so glad it is. It's so important and it is so interconnected when you look at those adversities that we go through as children and we can see how it plays out, but we don't necessarily have the words or the foundation or the components to identify or speak to that specifically. So that's what it does is it gives us that framework.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. It does. And so my goal now that I know this, is to visit with other colleagues in the long-term care profession, visit with families, visit with caregivers, so that they understand the feelings that they feel. Sometimes when you're a caregiver, you've got a certain amount of stress that you don't understand why the person you're caring for is behaving a certain way. You don't understand why the residents that live in your assisted living facilities are behaving a certain way. But once you become ACEs aware and trauma informed, that whole notion or that question that might be going around in your head around what is wrong with this person switches from that to what happened to this person. And so this idea of becoming trauma informed really allows and opens up the possibilities for curiosity,
Yes.
to really finding out, gosh, what did happen in this person's life that is having them behave in this way? And what is it that I can do to intervene in a very compassionate way to help them in their later years?
Yeah, it's that saying as you were sharing, hurt people hurt people.
Yeah.
You know,
Yes.
that whole component of that. So when we look at how we have those common types of childhood adversity that you shared that can impact our physical and mental health, how we show up in relationships, how we show up in receiving care, giving care. And as caregivers and as healthcare providers, how do we recognize the signs of trauma in older adults? And how do we address that, right? Or what are some effective strategies? So I guess that's kind of a two-sided question. So first, how do we recognize the signs of trauma?
That's a really great question. And I think the key takeaway here is that it's not necessarily, well, it is recognizing the signs of trauma, but first come to the conversation knowing that everybody likely has trauma. Again, going back to that 90% that the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services cites, that 90% of our older adults that we care for likely had trauma. So it's just automatically recognizing and becoming aware that we have a history.
Yeah.
And that history is extremely complex. And I'll give you a perfect example of an individual in my life that I've known probably now for 10 years. She's 91 now. And this is a woman that's a couple doors down from where I live. And we just have become really great friends over these last 10 years. And Nicole, it wasn't until recently that she shared with me that she's a Holocaust survivor. And she gave me very little information. What I know is that her family hailed from Eastern Europe and that her father went to a concentration camp, and her mother, and her siblings survived. And she was a very little girl when this happened, and they were able to immigrate to the United States and begin a life here. But as she said to me, she's like, she calls me Jeannie. She says, Jeannie, I don't have the tattoo on my arm, but I still have the scars. And so I think that's the approach that we as caregivers working with this particular generation, where talking about your problems and airing your family dirty laundry, if you will, just wasn't polite. That we have got to be very curious and able to think outside of the box, so that when we're seeing behaviors that may be perceived as maladaptive, we've got to see them as adaptive behaviors that the senior has acquired in order to cope with stress and trauma. So another perfect example, if you don't mind me pulling from kind of the life and career that I've lived with seniors, is that we had an individual that moved into our assisted living community. Her name is Jan, and she had lived in her apartment by herself for over 15 years. Was shopping, was walking, was even considering taking up pickleball at one point. But her macular degeneration and her low vision was causing her issues. So it was time to move to assisted living. Jan came to us a very healthy individual. Meaning physically she was healthy, she had a healthy weight. And again, like I said, she was an exerciser as well. But over time, within probably a 3-month stretch, she lost 15 pounds.
Wow.
And there was no reason for her to lose that much weight in that short amount of time. And what we discovered from her is that as we were working with her in the dining room, trying to find that menu that would be perfect for her palate, what we found is that it wasn't the menu or the food that we were serving. It was the fact that we were serving it in this giant dining room that was really luxurious, and she had to eat in front of other people.
Wow.
And that is something we uncovered with talking to some of her children, her adult children, that her mom always had a problem with. And it wasn't like they knew that. We were just connecting the dots with those adult children. It's like, tell me about how your mom used to enjoy food. Tell me about how she used to prepare it. And then it came down to that aha moment where we were like, maybe it's because she's with other people and she hasn't eaten with other people for over 15 years since her husband died. So we really looked at that and started carving out a special place for her, bringing meals to her room, etc. She never gained back all 15 pounds, but she did experience weight gain. And I think that was directly from that type of intervention of really looking not only at what's going on with her, but also the environment in which she's living.
Right. Not just looking at what is maybe the physical reason, but all of those other things that come into play. And it's because you really showed up with curiosity and kept asking the questions and diving in.
That's exactly
Mm-hmm.
right. I
Mm-hmm.
love that. Just
Mm-hmm.
keep asking the questions
Yeah.
because, it's not normal for that type of health outcome to happen so quickly.
Right.
When, we know that when seniors, older adults move into assisted livings, there's a period of adjustment. But this really was one that we had to address very
Mm-hmm.
quickly because it was so substantial
Yeah.
and something that could have caused other problems down the line.
Yeah. So that is a sign that for her, even probably the grief of losing a spouse and then her routine and the change and what that looks like. Withdraw is another one I feel like. Are there any other common signs of trauma that maybe people could say, you know what, we need to investigate this a little bit further. We need to think about maybe what's going on that you notice?
Yeah, there are actually, and it really comes down to understanding what an older adult's coping
Mm-hmm.
mechanisms were prior moving into assisted living or prior to having, a team of individuals coming into the home to take care of them.
Mm-hmm.
Because what happens when we move seniors into assisted living or nursing homes, like their coping strategies, whether that would be using food to cope and soothe, using alcohol to cope and soothe, use an animal to cope and
Mm-hmm.
soothe and to co-regulate, or smoking cigarettes or
Mm-hmm.
tobacco. Like when you move into assisted living, all of those things that help them cope with their trauma are gone.
Yeah,
And I think for
that's
a
so
while,
true.
the
Yeah.
senior really tries to keep up with this new way of living.
Mm-hmm.
But eventually, when those coping mechanisms aren't there, no access to alcohol, many facilities or most facilities are non-smoking. You
Mm-hmm.
pretty much eat on a schedule. You don't have your freezer full of Haagen-Dazs any
Yeah.
longer. That's when we start seeing the behaviors happen.
Mm.
So that's when the investigatory type of questions and interviewing the family and having some compassionate conversations with the older adult can occur.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah,
How do we do that effectively? And I know it's not one size fits all. So we're kind of talking in broader terms because we're each so unique and individual. Is there ways that you've seen this done in that supportive healing way?
there are. I think, again, the idea that every person that moves into your community is an individual is tantamount.
Mm-hmm.
And senior living facilities, I think, try to do as best of a job as they can, individualizing a care plan or individualizing how that resident wants to live
Mm-hmm.
in the community. But I think sometimes it falls short. And so having those conversations about grief and loss, right when an individual moves into your community, I think also is a way to kind of prevent and mitigate against maybe some of those negative behaviors that might occur.
Right.
Really find out for them. Like, are you a social person, or do you do better? A social person meaning, do you like the 50-person bingo,
Mm-hmm.
or are you the one-on-one canasta? Like really understanding how that person operates
Yeah.
to mitigate against that, those feelings of not belonging and those
Mm-hmm.
feelings of not fitting in exactly, I think really helps seniors
Mm-hmm.
adjust to a new environment. You can see on when the staff or team members are working with residents that, there's some residents that staff members just don't want to work with,
Yeah.
whether they feel like the resident is too angry or the resident is difficult to care for. That's kind of, again, when the investigation starts. Like, what is it exactly that is causing these negative reactions? And
Mm-hmm.
again, how can we build program and support around you so that you feel like you really belong here in your new home?
Yeah, that's so important. It is. And from the other side, looking at, okay, if we've got these principles in the lens of 90% have this trauma a part of our life and applying that care, whether it's in the senior living community or even at home with mom and dad or with the loved ones that we have in our life, break down for us some of the challenges we face when we're wanting to implement this lens, and then on the other side, that hope of what are those benefits that are born out of being able to work with individuals in this way.
Well, I give the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services a lot of credit for starting these conversations around requiring nursing homes to become trauma informed. I think it's a great start, but like I mentioned, I as an administrator and my colleagues that were also in the field didn't know what to do with it. I think the challenges to implementing something like this is that it really does take a lot of time to understand an individual's history, an individual's trauma, especially if they don't want to talk about it, and then to educate team members on what it means to be trauma informed. One of the biggest challenges, I think, in the short sightedness of the regulation, Nicole, is that the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services wants us to be trauma informed for our residents, but they kind of leave out this aspect that our employees also have to recognize and deal with their trauma in order to provide compassionate care to individuals that have experienced trauma. And what this is about essentially is that an unregulated person, meaning someone who's experienced trauma and their central nervous system can constantly and a lot of times be in fight, flight, freeze, or fawn mode, it's impossible for our frontline team members to come to work with that much stress and a heightened central nervous system and be expected to regulate individuals that they're caring for who have also experienced trauma. So the challenges and the opportunities for senior living communities and for families that are caring for their parents or grandparents at home is that you can start looking inside yourself. I think we've talked about before the pain assessment that I talk about when I'm giving talks. That pain stands for pay attention inside now. Like what is occurring in your physical body? And is that pain that you're experiencing, whether it's physical or emotional pain, giving you signals that there's something there to heal? And 9 times out of 10, when I walk through kind of the deeper dive into the pain assessment, everyone does recognize, yeah, my stomach always feels funny when I go home to see my parents, or, my eating is off, or all of a sudden my heartburn just really flares up. And so caregivers have those same responses. So how do you use that acronym of pay attention inside now to recognize that there is pain, first of all, but then do some self-discovery to understand its etiology. So I think that's a challenge for people. It was a challenge for me as a family caregiver. It was a challenge for the individuals that I work with in assisted livings and nursing homes to really want to take that very serious introspective look at kind of what is my life like now. But if it can be facilitated by an employer, if employee health can really help our frontline team members with depression screens and screening for social determinants of health and getting them the help that they need through EAP programs, there's just so much success to be gained, not only for frontline caregivers and the people that they're caring for, but society overall.
Oh, absolutely. And I've said this, I think, in a previous conversation that we had, that it's so uncomfortable to look at our own stuff, right? And caregiving teaches us, I believe, it's teaches us more about ourselves than sometimes we would like it to. And
Yeah.
it's an inside job of how do we manage our own emotions. And you mentioned the regulation. How do we regulate our central nervous system to then to be able to care well for other people as we're navigating some of our own emotions and past trauma within this new dynamic?
Yeah. Exactly right. Exactly right. And it really is. difficult. I don't want to kind of give it like all you have to do, like the list of the 5 things you need to do every day in order to be healed, in order to be trauma informed. It really isn't like that. Becoming, recognizing the incidences and occurrences that have occurred in your own life and how that impacts the way that you're showing up, whether it be as a family caregiver or an employee at an assisted living, is really difficult work to do. But my goal here, in talking to individuals like yourself and anybody else that will listen, is that you don't have to do it alone. There's so much that we've learned through the pandemic, that stigma around mental health is evaporating, I feel. And the generation that's coming up behind the Gen Z generation, the emoji generation, are really teaching us how to be in touch with our emotions and how to talk about them. That, anger is an emotion. Healthy anger and being able to express healthy anger and healthy sadness is an okay thing to have. And it's okay to happen, to express those things. And I think for such a long time, I'm a Gen Xer. I was born in 1970. I think even in my generation, it was not as popular to be as emotive, going back to the emojis, to being as of emotive with our emotions. And I'm just so glad and so thankful for the generation that's coming behind, a couple of generations behind me, that they're really bringing that to the forefront, that it's okay to have these emotions and express them.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. That was one of my questions is like, how do we overcome some of that stigma? And I think we're learning from people that are coming up behind us that there is more of an awareness of an expression of a conversation, and people are open about seeking support for their mental health, whether it's with a therapist, whether it's with a class or a course, or benefiting learning about all of that and how we dialogue and connecting there's these terms now that are new to our language, I believe, as talking to your inner child, and all of those tools and tips that we're able to now use in how we interact with people and care for people.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'll recommend for your listeners, the book called The Body Keeps the Score
Mm.
by Bessel van der Kolk. And what he tells us in that book is that our bodies will go along with kind of the story our mind is telling us. So for
Mm.
example, if you did experience, let's say, 4 different types of childhood adversity, um, there is a process where your body just absorbs that trauma, and it kind of gets locked in your trauma as a wound. And
Mm.
trauma in Greek is wound. And so that's where the word trauma came from.
Interesting. Thank you. I didn't know that.
Hmm. Hmm. And so trauma locks in our body as a wound, and our mind is programmed to forget about that wound so that we can function in society. And
Mm.
and we see this in particular with individuals that have been afflicted with child abuse or child neglect, that they have to continue to belong in that family. We as humans are social animals, so we have to our mind has to tell us a story that helps us maintain within that family that this is not happening, that I must be making this up, or the very worst, that it's happening to me because it's my fault.
Mm.
But as we matriculate into adulthood, typically what happens, or what can happen with an individual that has been abused throughout childhood, is that they'll have those coping mechanisms of smoking and using alcohol, or using food to soothe. Eventually, those coping strategies are not working any longer. And the body starts to wake up to the history that happened. And that's where the chronicity comes in,
Mm.
where when you hold so much inside of you, it can damage organs. It can cause chronic illnesses. And so there's a time in your life, typically midlife, where all of this comes crashing down, and the body and the brain want to meet up for the very first time. And that's where individuals really start to uncover, like you said, your inner child and all of those other things that we're learning about and talking about more frequently.
You explain that so well to the point where I think it's going to bring a lot of aha moments for people.
Yeah, I know.
Really,
I
really
know.
well. Oh,
Yeah, I talk a lot about to individuals about this, how do we get
mhm.
this message out
Yeah.
without having the proper supports in place for
Mm-hmm.
individuals?
Mm-hmm.
So I can talk on a podcast, I can continue to do my lecture series,
Mm-hmm.
but you're right. There isn't a talk or a webinar that I do where there isn't a person in the audience that either tears up
Right.
or has to go off camera or has to take a deep breath because something inside of them is going,
Mm-hmm.
me too.
The knowing. Yeah. The knowing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
So
that book is one perfect example of a place to go and a place for resource. Do you have any other ones that you like to direct people to that can provide that initial insight into that?
I do. So The Body Keeps the Score is largely written for psychiatrists and psychologists. But I tell everyone, don't be afraid of that because it's easily accessible to individuals that don't have their PhD in psychology or their MD in psychiatry. But that'll get you started. If you really want it, he writes it in such a beautiful way that he intersects kind of some vignettes of clients that he's worked with over the years and what they experienced and then how they healed.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a really great book. And you get all of the brain science and all of the body science in it as well. Um, there's a new book out that I'm conquering right now called The Myth of Normal by Gabor Mate. And if folks aren't readers, boy, you can just Google these books and watch videos of their
Mm.
interviews and get the general essence of the book just by watching those interviews. But the myth of normal really deconstructs how we're living our lives today and goes from the micro level, meaning us and the food that we put in our bodies and the lack of sleep that we get, and working on our devices until the wee hours of the
Mm-hmm.
morning, watching TikTok videos, like what that's doing to us. So he starts kind of at the micro level, but then branches out all the way up to climate change,
Wow.
how what we're doing to Mother Earth as a symbol of, a body, in stripping it of its resources and not returning to it the nutrients that it needs to grow healthy plants that we can then eat to be
Mm.
healthy individuals. He kind of ties all of that together. And I would challenge anyone to pick up that book, but then challenge people not to think that they're going to be the same person after reading it because it really does put trauma in the context of not only us individually and families and society, but then moves it all the way to climate change, and it's very intriguing.
What
If you
perspective?
want more of a clinical lens, the Centers for Disease Prevention, the CDC, is also a great place to tap into some more clinical research. And the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, also known as SAMHSA, is another great resource if you want to know what's happening in the world of childhood trauma, adult trauma, and elder trauma.
Thank you for that. It's helpful. It's so great.
Yes, and I'm a resource.
You are.
Share my information
You
to
are.
folks. I'd be happy. You can tell I can talk about this all day long,
Yes,
um,
yes. And
and would be happy to talk to anybody about it.
we will be sure. And this episode will reach so many people, and we will share all of your information so people can directly contact you in the show notes. So if you're listening, look for Jean's info. And how do you see this field of senior care, trauma informed care evolving in the next decade? And what role do you see this playing for all of us?
I think that senior care is really going to undergo significant change.
Yeah.
And you and I have been in this field for a long time.
Mhm.
And while we see change, meaning regulations that we have to follow or a new type of payer like Medicare Advantage, like all of these things, these different types of providers that are moving into the field, having individuals, really latch onto this idea of longevity and how to live longer. All of that, I think, is going to have a major impact on how care and services are delivered. I do think that the very large organizations, like the large assisted livings and large nursing homes, will need to become smaller and more affordable for individuals. One of the statistics that I read recently is that by 2030, 11 million individuals will not be able to afford assisted living, and they're not quite income eligible to apply for Medicaid. So we've got this vast majority of individuals that can't afford a lot of the places that we lead and that we manage. So that too, I think, is really going to put traumatic crunch on states and local governments on what do we do with individuals that can't afford this? Will they become homeless? Should they lose their home?
Right.
The way that trauma plays into this, I believe, or becoming a trauma-informed organization plays into this, I believe, is that we're going to need resilient individuals working with older adults that are experiencing homelessness, that are experiencing moving into assisted livings that they didn't choose. So it really, for me, always points back to the caregiver first and helping them improve their own lives by becoming trauma informed and get them on a path to healing so that they can turn around then and help those that we serve in long-term care.
Yeah, so that we can be equipped. And
Mhm.
when you talk about just the number of adults that are going to be in that middle, it also speaks to the overwhelm and how family caregivers, right? The number we use now is 53 million unpaid family caregivers that are having to literally uphold and support the healthcare system for their loved one because they're in this middle world. And I believe adult day care and adult day programs will have to play an important role as we look at how do we address care needs and support and education in ways that are manageable and affordable.
Right. Yep. Absolutely.
It's going to be,
Absolutely.
yeah, interesting to see how it comes together. Oh my goodness. So much change, but I'm hopeful because I think that that's my lens though, right, is hopeful. So while it
Mm,
can be discouraging to hear and we know that we've got challenge to overcome, I believe there are good people that really want to try to make a difference and make change in the ways that we can, although we know it's a big system and it's going to be, that uphill battle.
yeah. Yes, I agree with you. You mentioned family caregivers, and I think that is most definitely part of the future. Well, it's
Hmm.
part of the present.
Right.
And so I really do think as I prepare for my older adult years, I'm thinking to myself, where am I going to end up?
Hmm.
How is this going to look? So could I go back to my college days where I lived with four other women that were in college, all friends of mine? And it was like, okay, Jennifer, you get the beer and I'll get the pizza, and
Oh, yes.
Ariane's going to cover the electric bill this month.
Hmm.
Like, are there ways that we can think about of these kind of natural occurring retirement communities where we can put people together for
Yeah,
that socialization and for that to share the financial burden?
completely. I talk about that with my girlfriends. We're always like, oh, wouldn't it be so great if we could all live together again someday if
Yeah,
we needed to? That's what life looked like, right? Just being, thinking about how do we make it work while bringing us that support and options, looking at it
exactly.
differently.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, the numbers are too large.
Hmm.
It's got to be going back to the public policy experience that I had when I worked on Capitol Hill. There's got to be something done there that is going to incentivize building projects that are more affordable. And again, maybe even though the R word regulation I really wasn't a fan of when I was an administrator, I don't know that we have enough regulation of our private equity partners that are coming into the market in such an aggressive fashion. So I would like to see some governmental oversight of those types of transactions and nuances that are occurring right now.
Yeah, I can see that. Do you have your hand on the pulse of what maybe is coming down the line policy wise that is interesting or that our listeners would maybe like to know about?
I think that one of the biggest battles, if you will, right now between providers and the CMS and with Congress right in the middle of those two
Mm-hmm.
is that this idea that there have to be mandates for how many staff members are employed or on any given shift in a nursing home.
Right,
There's, a lot of kickback from providers indicating that that's an impossible goal to achieve.
right.
While at the same time, the government is saying you must achieve it because, you've got, in some cases, the horror stories of one certified nursing assistant taking care of 40 individuals. So there's
Mm-hmm.
that real push pull that is occurring from a workforce standpoint. I haven't necessarily seen anything related to the regulation of private equity, with the
Mm-hmm.
exception of there are some proposals that will demand, if you will, more transparency in who owns specific corporations and specific organizations so that there's more transparency to the consumers that
Right,
consume the product.
right. Yes, I know that is a conversation as corporations are bought by those firms, and then it's just a whole different way of doing business and operations and hands changing. And so understanding what that looks like long term, how it affects
Yeah.
everybody. Yeah, from the top
Yep.
down. Yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
And I think, speaking of what is out there, there's may also be a push, Nicole. One day, I hope that consumers will really have a voice,
Mm-hmm.
and that I don't know that I love the nursing homes that I used to work at, meaning I love them as an organization, but I don't know if I want to live there.
Right.
And I wonder if providers are able to have that honest conversation. Like, would you live in the place that you own and manage?
Mm-hmm.
Like, when you age, is this where you want to be? And if someone's honest, I don't know if they would be able to answer yes.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and so what is it that we need to do to create a system where older adults can age where they want to age, whether that be at home or in a community?
Exactly. I always try to encourage families that, in all the podcasts that I've done and the conversations that I've had, it's empowering families that they have agency to
Hmm.
speak up, to use their voice, to demand better. I did a podcast with a company called Viking Pure Solutions. They're a non-toxic cleaning solution. And our lens was families have a right to say, I would like clean, non toxic products to be used where my loved one lives, not only for their health, but the health of the employees, for the safety, that we have. That's just one example of being able to speak up. So if anyone's listening, the more that we do that, the more that we know we have agency, that things don't always just have to be done in the way that they've always been done, that we can
Right.
challenge that. I just want to empower people to be able to do that. And it feels scary when we first do it. Trust me. I'm always like, oh, okay, I'll be strong, but I'm like a little nervous. But I'm going to keep
Yep.
doing it. So
Yep.
just to keep doing that, and whether that's at letting your local, government officials know how you feel about things, and your communities and your friends and all of that.
Yeah, exactly. On that note, you're so inspiring in terms of using your voice and this vehicle of a podcast to get this information out to people in all different facets of growing
Mhm.
old and being cared for when we're older. Um, and to your point, in the fall of this year, I'm so excited that I will be launching what's called the Elder Care Academy here in Omaha, Nebraska, where I'm doing 5 weeks of intensives with community members. So it's open to any community member that wants to come to the Jewish Community Center and learn about long term care. And the goal of that, there'll be some talk about trauma, but the overall goal is to really arm citizens with information on what the long-term care system is. And really, when a daughter is in that situation or their mother's in that situation, that they can be their own best advocate because they'll know the language, they'll know the structure, they'll know their rights, they'll know the history, how our long-term care system develops. So they'll have all of that information with them as they interface with these organizations. So that kicks off in the fall, and I'm super excited for it.
I am so excited. And that's what it will do is empower people and families and communities to know, right? To be armed with that information. And we will
Yep.
share about that absolutely so people can know where to sign up, where to learn more. And for people that are interested in promoting this work, learning more about you, trauma informed care, tell us how we can connect with you and how you support people.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I would love to share that. So right now I'm just launching an organization called Radical Sabbatical. And so since 2019, pardon me, since 2021, when my mom had a stroke, is when I needed to go on a radical sabbatical. So had to leave the profession that I loved and really focused on family caregiving up until mom and dad died. And I want to take all that I've learned from both managing institutional care environments and also family caregiving, coupled with the information and passion that I have for trauma, and roll it into a company called Radical Sabbatical. So that is now forming. So I don't have a website or a Facebook page or any of that fun stuff for someone to interact with, but I am available in person. If people want to do Zoom calls or conference calls or what have you, if they're struggling with something that they're trying to solve in senior care, I'm here for them. So right now it'll be a phone number and an email, but eventually, probably within the year, it'll be much more.
So good. Yes. And depending on when this is released, we might have that available. So look for that. And
Sure.
if not, we know where to find you via email. And you are also on LinkedIn. And
Yes.
so those are good places. But I'm so thankful for your perspective and wisdom. I've learned so much. I'm just so grateful for you. So thank you for joining me and sharing about this. It was so fun to talk with you about it.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you. I appreciate you so much.
Thank you for listening today. If you enjoyed our episode, please subscribe and give us 5 stars. In all honesty, we'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for listening to our episode.